Hello and welcome to the Thompson Dunn YouTube channel. We're going to be posting recordings on our channel from workshops and webinars we've been running in the last few weeks. Put together a series of 3 webinars, the first of which will follow this introduction. It's entitled Leading Yourself Through Change. We hope you enjoy it and we hope to welcome you on our live webinars in the future. Enjoy. So I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully all of you will be able to see this. Let's do that. Can I see a lot of nodding heads, if that's there? Excellent. Well, look, this is a really important topic and something that Pat and I and Deanna and I have discussed a lot in the current circumstances, because clearly change goes on all the time. And at the moment, we're all globally experiencing something that is unprecedented in certainly in my generation and probably all of ours, in the sense of this is a very strange time to be pushed into an enormous change process without any necessarily understanding of where the boundaries of this are, where the end point of this is. And we thought, well, this is a really important time for us to share with our clients, our friends, our colleagues, some observations on change from a psychological perspective, to help people to think more in a more whole-brained way about the process of change. So what I'm going to be doing today, as I say, I've got about a half an hour session put together where we'll look at the concept of change and maybe have a bit of a situational analysis on what we're all facing at the moment. Look at the lessons we can learn from this period and see how we can look at it in a more positive and proactive sense by exploring the curve of change and understanding how we can take agency in our own processes of change. So when we move through it to whatever the new normal will be, we will be active agents and leaders in the change process, having thought about change from an internal perspective. So that's a kind of overview of that. And I should have clicked on that slide. That's a kind of agenda. But what I also wanted to put together is maybe some suggested tips for leading yourself through change from a very personal perspective. I think a lot of us have done a certain amount of introspection over our lives and careers, and give you some pointers about maybe where you can focus your processing of change based on your skills, your preferences, your capabilities, etc. So I'm really looking forward to talking about that in some detail. We'll start the session now if everyone is okay with that. Some nodding heads, it's good. I was saying before we start, I feel somewhat of a newsreader here and sitting in the chair and not being able to hear your voices, but I will pause at various stages so we can have a more active discussion. Let's get started. So something I talk a lot about with my clients is thinking in 3 dimensions, and that probably needs to be broken down a little bit. So what I wanted to do is point you guys in the direction of thinking about change from different perspectives, having a different perception on the problems or issues that you are facing. And if we can take the COVID-19 coronavirus issue, clearly there is a lot of stuff about following the science, learning from the data. And that's really important. And I think it's the correct way to be leading a body of people around the world through this very difficult, changing world that we're facing. But there are also other aspects of it that you can ask yourself and others in relation to their perception or your perception of this change. How is it affecting you in a whole-brained way? What's going on? How is that affecting your life? Why are we facing these challenges? And why are we either finding this a very oppressive period? If you're someone who's quite gregarious and needs to be out and with people, why is one of the fundamental questions that I think we always need to be asking of ourselves: why am I feeling this particular way? Not just why do I think that? And the who question is always one that we always want to focus in on as well. Who is affected by this, and how can we think about it in an interpersonal way as well as an objective, real life crisis? So that whole-brained approach, taking the what, how, why, and who analysis, I think is going to be really helpful for people, not just now, but in terms of how they process and manage change going forward. There's a concept that I like to also think about, which is something that we acquire in our very early childhood, in our child development. I think it's really helpful to go back to how we operate and intuit the world as children when we first are born into it, because we can't count, we can't write, we can't spell, or our logical brain is an acquired thing. And John Piaget, who's a famous developmental psychologist, talked about something that is labeled decentration, which is the ability to establish that three-dimensional view of something. So taking a different perspective by decentering from where your position is, and being able to take the position of someone else or a different place in the room, for example, is something I do when I present, although I can't do it here. If I'm in a room with people, I like to sit in different seats before I start the presentation, because I get an understanding of what the discussion will look like from that perspective, at least an objective one, at least a physical one. And decentration, involving that ability to pay attention to multiple attributes, I think is really important to leading yourself through change. And curve line thinking. I mean, a lot of what we're hearing is very logical and rational analysis of this particular crisis, but you can take any change process. You know, what and the how questions are often arrived at first. And that can be very straight lined in your thinking, very sequential. And that has benefit if you have a whole brain plan for you to execute various stages in order to move through the curve of change. But something that I'd like to talk about is the ability to think around the issue and potentially find yourself in a different phase of the curve of change, which we're going to analyze in a moment's time. You might find that you are past from a sequential point of view, you might find that you are past a particular phase of a curve of change, but that means that you maybe still need to go back and process that change. So thinking in curve lines allowed you to be more three-dimensional and not need necessarily a model to guide you through a process of change, rather than what. It can be why, then how, then what are we going to do? And I like to talk about that in terms of curve change. And this is the real crux, I think, of most change processes, is getting comfortable with the uncomfortable nature of reality. And those of you familiar maybe with some change analyses in your careers, the reality is really, when we arrive at the reality, we tend to take a step away from a declining emotional and physical state and start to move towards a more progressive climbing state, because we've acknowledged the reality of the situation. And that can be very painful and can take a long time to get to. And so in some cases, that's fine, particularly if you take the global crisis we're facing now. The reality of it is quite difficult to ascertain, because we don't know when things will cease and we will curve off at the top and plateau. And we don't know the effect of what we're doing from social distancing really in real terms. But we can certainly find our own reality and our own position in a process of change based on our whole brain thinking and an understanding of who we are and how we like to think about the process of change. But the real skill of people who can work with change effectively are those that are comfortable with the uncomfortable nature of it. My last point, second to last point here, is one of the things that I think is a real positive to a change process is almost all, I'm thinking broadly speaking of most change processes that I've experienced or even worked on, there is a silver lining that can be found. And if you think about this particular time that we're facing, the tools and the skills that we acquire in the face of completely unprecedented change could and should and will set us up to be more effective leaders of change from a personal and potentially team or organizational perspective when the new normal settles down. We will have forged incredibly valuable skills and tools that will allow people to follow your lead, having done a lot of processing and thinking about change as a concept and as an actual activity. And lastly, I wanted to point out, it's something I think we sometimes forget when we're involved in a change process, either organizationally or potentially with others. There is often a feeling that you do not have much agency in the process of change. But the one thing you have absolute agency of is your own internal process of change, how you think about how it's affecting you in a whole brain way and what that means for you and what skills and tools and methodologies can you apply in order to make sure that in the best will in the world, you're okay. And that gives you enormous power because no one can take away the agency of how you think and feel. And some of you may be familiar with this or something similar to this. It's something that Pat and I have used a lot over the years when we're working with individuals and teams in changing circumstances. And I'll just give you an overview of how I would present this and talk about it as a phased processing of change. This is a model built by Spencer and Adams there. So there's the science. There are, from analysis, from their data analysis, they perceived that there were various stages in the process of change, either on an individual, group, or whole organizational level. And they plotted those changes along that blue line, which has, starting with initial enthusiasm lost and ending in integrating what do the changes mean on a grander scale. And the two axes, the X and Y, performance and morale on the left, and then time along the bottom. And the blue line roughly plots a general process of change for an individual, group, or organization. And the red line is often what we either expect of ourselves or our bosses, managers, whole organization, senior leadership expect that that's what they would prefer and expect would happen. So it's not that they don't acknowledge that change will have a negative effect on performance and morale, but they underestimate how much time will need to pass for people to safely, healthily, intellectually, and emotionally process the change that they're facing. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. And I wanted to point particularly to the very bottom of the blue curve, which is labeled the pit and the reality. This is the point I was making on the previous slide. As soon as you can get to that, there is a positive pathway through to starting to let go of the past and have energy and enthusiasm return and find meaning in the new world order. And I was curious to think about this curve in relation to what I've thought about on change processes I've consulted on in the past, but also clearly of what we're all facing now. I think individually, we will probably find ourselves at different phases of this curve. And as a model, it would suggest that there is a very linear way to move through it. So starting with a loss of enthusiasm and a loss of focus, and then once worked through integrating what the changes mean on a grander scale. I was thinking about lots of people that I know and have worked with, and certainly my own experience, I have found that in analyzing the world's global crisis we have now from a change angle, I've found a lot of my thinking has been at the right end of this curve rather than following a step-by-step process. And that's probably because I have a particular personality type, and I have a particular brain that works in a different way, probably most likely. And I blame my father for that, who's a GP who's just gone back into practice to support the NHS, which my mother is not delighted about, but understands on a medical angle that he has a responsibility to do that. But he would find a lot of meaning and make sense before anything had worked through. And he's offered some amazing commentary on what he sees from a medical angle when we're talking about this process of change that the world is facing. But the key for healthy moving through change from a change curve perspective is that we at least attend or acknowledge that each of these phases will hit us at some point in time, or it should. Some people may deny the denial phase or deny the reality, which can be quite unhealthy as you go forward. So from an advice point of view and a bit of a tip, from a model perspective, it would be very possible to see whether you go through these phases sequentially, starting at the left and moving to the right. But if you don't feel that, maybe just spend a bit of time acknowledging that those phases are probably something you should at least attend to, either intellectually or emotionally, ideally both, in order to move through safely and securely, but very successfully. So on the various points that we just made, I think there are some general tips that can be made for individuals. And what I might do is look at talking about skills and preferences and personalities in a moment, might analyze a particular type of person and their personality and give you some examples of what those individuals with that typology may need in order to effectively manage change for themselves and potentially for others. And I'll do that in a general way because if you've worked with us, we've worked with all sorts of tools. MBTI and Decision Profile are two of our preferred tools. When you marry those up, you find ways that, okay, everybody's different, but there are general things that a particular profile like an ESTJ would prefer to have in a changing circumstance in order to accelerate successfully the change process. So I'll maybe analyze that in a second. The first thing I did want to say is maybe the hope piece as well. Play to your strengths. Play to your strengths. Think about what you're really comfortable with and maybe what you're a little uncomfortable with, and start with what you're good at. I always reference a lot of my sporting experiences when I was younger. I used to play a lot of rugby, and used to spend a lot of time trying to get better at stuff that I was never going to be particularly good at. For example, I was a back in rugby, and I did a lot of running and sprinting. I wasn't too physical. I wasn't like the big guys up front. So why was I going to ever try to be that? I had strengths in other areas, and I could curtail the potential missing weak points that I had by playing in a team environment. But I was only of any use to the team environment if I was playing to my strengths. Leverage your personality, skills, and different capabilities in order to play to your strengths. And if we do sort of summarize that point I just made earlier, if you think about, and for those of you who aren't familiar with MBTI, it's a well-established personality assessment tool which gives you a particular typology based on a number of scales. And an ESTJ is probably the most predominant in the general population, although we are always getting new stats on what's predominant in particular industries and different sectors, etc. But generally, ESTJ we see a lot of. And that is a very extroverted character, someone who is, so that's the letter E. S, sensing, that is someone who likes information that is available to them through the five senses, stuff they can see and touch and smell, they like tangible stuff. Thinking, they tend to be very logical, rational personalities, so quite left-brained. Therefore, a model is really quite good for ESTJ because it can show you a pathway to move things through. And the J is something called judging, which is how you deal with the world. And judging personalities like to have order and clarity and systems and processes that allow them to get an organized plan for how to approach the challenges ahead. So from a moving through change point of view, an ESTJ would want time to talk, information, communication to be heard, and have action points to be getting on with. I feel very much for the gregarious amongst us. I'm sure that they're on Zoom and webinars and FaceTime. It's more than they've ever been in their lives at the moment, trying to maintain that contact. And I think that's really important. If you have that extroverted personality, find multiple ways to get your gregarious fix or your external information in order to support you at this time. But in general, that's a general point. The sensing preference, ES, think about specifics, seek data, seek opinion, get a realistic picture. If that S person can get a realistic picture, that pit, the reality of the curve can be achieved quicker. And that hopeful up curve, as Anne was talking about, can be achieved quicker if we're thinking in a very sequential way. Thinking preference, logical, systematic. Give me clarity in what's going to happen and when. And I'm very slightly a T on a reported MBTI, and that's something I'm very frustrated at the moment, not because I expect government or leaders to know exactly what will happen by when, but to have some kind of reality to say, look, it is unpredictable exactly when this will happen. However, when we know more, we will tell you. That at least reassures, it doesn't leave stuff hanging. So I think that what is the goal? And it's very demonstrative of competent leadership to say, we clearly need some rationality and logic in order to give you some information, but not knowing is okay as long as you are seeking to learn and seeking to understand. And finally, that J preference in the most common personality type, generally speaking, clear, concise plan, defined outcomes, and a time frame. And at the moment, we can't have that in a lot of ways. And in lots of change processes, it's also not necessarily possible to determine that clear time frame. But the biggest piece of advice I give to clients is the best way to get to that point is to find a way to safely, securely, and healthily, but quickly get to the reality of the situation. That ESTJ, that's kind of generally a good tip for a large proportion of the population. Of course, there are many others, and we consult with those. So when we do our analyses, we think about individuals and collectives. And when we work with you, or have worked with you in the past, or work with you in the future, we're more than likely to process this analysis on where is this group from an individual personality, skills, decision-making styles, abilities, where are they at? And what do we need to do in order to find a methodology to get to the reality and to move them through? That's kind of to Emma's point. A little bit of introspection on who we have will help us to find the best plan for change going forward. And these are quite general points, but I think really important. Reflect on your journey. As I said earlier, I get it from my father, I'm 100% sure. With this, what we're facing at the moment, I've spent far more time in the integrating and what the meaning is and why this could be really important to learn from it, rather than necessarily accepting the reality that I'm sat here with my partner and my dog probably for the next 3 months, which is a delightful place to be. But I know on some level that reality will hit home, and it'll probably hit home at a very difficult and probably not ideal time. And how that comes out will be me processing it in the way that's very human, very natural to me. And I strongly advise that you should attend to and notice your process. It's a bit of mindfulness stuff in here, perhaps, but I don't work with that particularly as a consultant, but it is a mindful approach to where am I today in this moment. Find an anchor for where you are in that moment. And a good way to do that is to look at the clock and say it's 11:30 on a Tuesday morning and my name is Michael, Ran, or Emma, or whoever. I've got an anchor in today, and how you're processing that is really important to reflect upon. And this put your house in order is, I just think it's so important to make sure that your process of change from a leadership perspective is starting from putting your house in order and process change from a position of strength. Treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. You start with those points, then when you are leading change beyond yourself and in the world of your consulting or in business or whatever it might be, you've done the work to some extent, or doing the work, because we always should be continuing to reflect on process. You're doing it on yourself. You at least have your own agency, but the respect of others to say, I can see that you are working on your process and you can help me process what I'm dealing with. And finally, I think finding the balance between solving the problem in the now and learning to live with the as yet unresolved issues is kind of critical, because change can look like the biggest mountain that you have to climb. And some issues you will be able to resolve, but there will be some that you can't. And they will only emerge when we have the right access to resources. So back to COVID-19, the only real way to get a real secure handle on this and to deal with it is to have obviously a vaccine and the relevant tests in order to control things. And in the meantime, the way of resolving it is to try and contain with social distancing and isolation. And hopefully we see some positive effects of that when people aren't just being stupid in Pat's alleyway outside her home or in the parks. Or we have to encourage each other to say, no, I'm approaching change by doing this and thinking about that. And you should too, because it will be how we deal with our own leadership of our own change that will allow us to be in a position to shape your own future, but others will follow you because they won't have done this work. This work is critical, I think, to being a good change leader in the future. Well, we hope you enjoyed that recording, and we would love to welcome you for a live webinar in the future. The next one that will appear in this series is called Transitioning to Create the New, and we'll follow this post. So hopefully you've enjoyed the content so far and you will tune in to the second recording. Nice to have your company, and we'll see you again soon.